Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, welcome to the CAS channel, CAS YouTube channel. This is the first of the live interview that we are doing, and we hope that in future CAS is able to do more and more informative and get more and more people on the CAS channel. We request all of you to follow it, to subscribe to it, and also pass it on. Today, our guest is Air Marshal Dipendu Chaudhary, and let me have the pleasure of introducing you to him. Air Marshal Dipendu Chaudhary, Param Vishesh Seva Medal, Ati Vishesh Seva Medal, Vayu Medal, and Vishesh Seva Medal. Highly decorated officer, is a third generation Air Force pilot who has put in 5,000 sorties of operational flying exclusively on the frontline Air Force fighter aircrafts. He has commanded 2 frontline operational bases and the Air Force's Top Gun School. As an Air Marshal, he was SASO Senior Air Officer, Staff Officer in the Western Air Command, the largest air command in India. He has led IF contingents in 3 international air exercises, namely with the US, France, and UAE. Due to his vast experience in formulation of strategy and development of doctrines, he has been a member of defense talk teams with Israel and China. He retired as the Commandant of the National Defense College. Post-retirement, the Air Marshal is an active member of the academia, and he writes extensively on matters of the air power and national security. Today, we will be talking to him about relevance of air power in the Indian context. Good morning, Air Marshal Chaudhary, and welcome to the CAS show.
Good morning, General. It's a pleasure to be on the first ever, I think, live show of CAS, and it certainly puts me under some healthy pressure for that.
No, I would say on the return that there could not have been a better person than you to come on this first edition of this show. And I'm sure in times to come, it will be well subscribed and looked at.
I'm sure, sir.
So
thank you.
I will, without much ado, start with the question answer sessions. I have formulated a fair number of questions for you, and I'll be digging inside deep into your thought process and how the Air Force thinks. So my first question comes that what makes a country an air power? What constitutes, and does India fit into that bill?
Air power, actually, when we look at it from a general term perspective, sir, it technically it constitutes all elements of aerial platforms and vehicles and other systems which constitute a nation's aviation capability. Now, this includes military aviation and civil aviation as well. But when we talk about air power per se, I think internationally the convention is that we usually mean military air power. And that's why the Indian Air Force, when we talk about air power, it tends to constitute the Indian Air Force. The other services do have their air elements as well. The Army has this aviation corps, the Navy has this naval air arm, but those are service specific. So when you talk about air power of a nation, it usually constitutes its Air Force. And our Air Force, I think it is the 4th largest Air Force in the world, and it's one of the oldest Air Forces in the world. It has sort of came to being pre-independence in way back in 1932. But what is very interesting is that in the recent years, the world, they have a directory, a military aviation directory, which has constituted a study, and it rates Indian air power from its capability and not just its mere numbers as the 3rd most capable Air Force in the world in terms of ranking. I mean, the first 3 positions obviously go to the US and the navies, and then we come down along the way. And that it's a recognition itself that we certainly do have a air power in our country.
Okay, that was a sitter. I know. I just wanted to pinprick you for that. My next question comes that now that we are sure that India constitutes the 4th largest air power, we have a mix of inventory, Air Force inventory, aircraft, and we have the Russian origin. In fact, we depended on the Russian origin for a long period of time, and now we also have the Western, the NATO countries. So is this an ideal mix? Is this out of compulsion? Or is it because of shortage of aircrafts not available that we've gone for this combination? Is there a logic to it, or there is no logic?
Most certainly, there's a logic. I mean, I don't think any nation, given a choice, would like to land up in a state with such a wide mixed inventory from all over practically from all over the world. But its genesis is not new. So it goes back, if I may remind you, General, if you look back in post 1947, we were hived off what was earlier the erstwhile Royal Air Force, which became the Indian Air Force in 1932. And post independence, we were divided into the Indian Air Force and the Pakistan Air Force. So assets were redistributed. And immediately after that, for some time, in the initial early 60s, late 50s and early 60s, we did have a fair amount of support from UK and the USA to build up our air forces. But very interestingly, post 1962, in fact, that's the time US came to India and along with UK and Australia to carry out an air power exercise. But thereafter, as we come closer to 1965, around the mid 60s or early 60s, Pakistan Air Force was given an enormous amount of assistance by the US. So there was a shift away from US inventory to our west. And that led us with no choice but to look at Russia. And Russia was a strategic, I would say, a friend indeed. And it supported us tremendously with the Russian platforms. And along the way, as AirPA itself developed, platforms developed, we diversified into French platforms. But I must tell you this, that there have always been a compulsion of sorts, which are geopolitical, of national interests, and a mix of how much we could afford. That is the most important bottom line. So this choice, the situation we have landed up was certainly not of our own making. And given a choice, we would like to narrow down the platforms, which I think over a period of time will happen. But we went through a phase of evolution, which we really didn't have any choice in the matter.
Okay, I think that very nicely answered, and I will leave for a later time. If we have the time to quiz you upon what was your personal choice on the types of aircraft, but we'll take that up a little later. But building up from there, we keep hearing in the press and in the newspapers. Otherwise, India is looking for a certain amount of scouts for its national security as far as the Air Force is concerned, and that figure is widely shot. I believe now it has come to 42, and we have something about 35. I might be wrong on that, whatever little, but there is a huge gap. So, can you tell me how does this number come to it, and how critical is this gap?
So, post-independence, in fact, after the 1960s, there was one study carried out during immediately after the 1947-48 war, with the first Kashmir war, and there was a thought at that point in time. The first time we came around and assessed how much of air power would we need. But very interestingly, I must give a little background to it, that there was a Blackett committee which carried out a study from UK, and they sort of constrained the Indian Air Force's growth to a tactical air force. You must remember that we were a legacy of the Brits, as I mentioned, and they kept the strategic role to themselves. That means the bombers, the more modern platforms were flown by their pilots, and it was controlled by them. And the Indian Air Force's origin was a tactical air force, essentially to support the surface operations in the Burma campaign. First in the northwest frontier province to do sort of stabilize the volatile tribal regions, but more certainly towards when the World War was in the thick of it, in the Burma campaign to hold off the Japanese. And Indian Air Force played a sterling role there. But when the independence came, we actually inherited a legacy of a tactical air force, which essentially meant no bombers. And though the Indian Air Force was aware of its necessity for bombers and contracted for Canberras in between, but technically we remained a tactical air force, or our mindset remained that for some time. But over the years, we realized the need to expand, and this reality actually hit us the most in 1962 or post 1962, when I think we made the fatal mistake of not committing our air power in the Chinese operations. And my personal feeling is, given the state of the Chinese Air Force then, and our capabilities, and we had fought in Burma, we had fought in the first Kashmir war, we were a fairly experienced Air Force, and we had fair amount of capability at that time. And if we had been committed into battle in an offensive use of air power, I personally feel that the China war outcome possibly may have been different and would have actually altered the future of air power in Asia. But that notwithstanding, after the war, there was also a Tata committee which sat down, which talked about 60 squadron air force, catering for
Oh,
the needs of, because the the first time in 62 war, the realization came that China was also an adversary. Earlier, we were Pakistan centric, now became China centric. So it looked at 60 squadrons, which over the years sort of whittled down along the way, and we stabilized at somewhere between 45 and 42. And 42 is standard, what is been going on for the last about 10 years, which is accepted in the parliament as well. So that is how it is 42 squadrons for possibly what 42 combat squadrons of what possibly was a threat scenario when it was conceived.
okay.
But given the present circumstances, I would like to think that this number may not be certainly enough for a two-front collusive war. But given the challenges of adding on inventory, we've seen how critical and how difficult it is. And we're struggling at this point in time with just about 32, 33 squadrons. And we're at the nadir of our inventory capability. Mind you, we're nadir in terms of numbers, but I must elaborate here. We have a fair amount of capability. Our capacity right now is in the lower side. But ideally, this is something which we really need desperately to hit a number of at least 42 squadrons. But what is more important is rather than being number centric about it, what we need to add on is high capability platforms and squadrons which are coming in, which are future capable, which have vast amount of capabilities than the single type role capabilities of the past of merely a strike aircraft or a air defense aircraft. But you're looking at multi-role combat aircraft, which are capable of performing all sorts of roles. But 42, if you ask me so frankly, I don't think it's a adequate number, but it's a number which is out there. But given the production capabilities and induction capabilities, we'll have a hard time even hitting 42.
Okay, I get the gist of what you're saying, but I still have a doubt which is coming to my mind. That means this number is subjective to some either a threat perception, a collusive threat, something like that. So it could go up and it could go down. And in your perception, it is actually down. It should go up, even the expected number of 42. But do you not factor into this uh, the capability of the aircrafts as you go ahead in time? A weapon platform which is going to come up in future, probably one of them could be equivalent to two. So is that process also factored into it or not factored into it? I hope you got my question.
Absolutely, sir. I must clarify here a very interesting aspect here that unlike most of the air forces in the world and most of the air power theory and studies of the last 2 decades, I will say, post Gulf War, they are Western precepts, Western studies, Western analysis, and which unfortunately has all these analysis and which has come out are from wars which has had practically no air opposition. If you look at the Gulf War onwards, there have been no air opposition at all. Look at Ukraine and Russia, very limited air opposition, which came to a grinding halt when Ukraine ran out of fighters and they're desperately trying to get inducting F-16s now. Look at Israel. It doesn't have any air opposition, can do what it wants. But in our case, we have a situation in our hands where we have two adversaries who are strategic partners, who are collusive in our air power threat, which we'll discuss probably a little later. But what is interesting is Pakistan is a near peer air force. It's a professional air force. It's a capable air force, and it has kept current in tactics and capabilities throughout its entire years, all these years. China has evolved into one of the largest air forces in the world. It is now narrowed down to its focus of becoming a world-class air force, which is Xi Jinping's dream. And very interestingly, Mark Welsh, who was a US Air Force general about 3-4 years back, he made a comment that by 2030, the Chinese Air Force would outnumber the US Air Force. So clearly, the Chinese Air Force is still expanding. So this is something we have to bear in mind, that while if our enemies or if our adversarial situations had stabilized into a reality of a stable future, we could have managed with the lesser numbers. but not in the present circumstances, and most certainly not, in my view, in the near and the immediate future.
Fair enough. Fair enough. I take you on onto the China issue that you just brought up. How does the Indian Air Force compare to the Chinese Air Force on a generic level? And on the second, that the Indian Air Force, as I understand, has a superiority in terms of fighting edge in Tibet, which is the area which is closest to China. And how do you figure China trying to bridge that gap between them and us? Because today I think we have an edge over them. So how does the equation between the Chinese Air Force and the Indian Air Force compare today, keeping in mind the Tibet Plateau or the height of it?
That's an excellent question. Actually, it's very relevant to our circumstances. But while I cover this question, must give a little background to this. That the Chinese Air Force, actually the transition point was the Gulf War, which they watched very, very closely. And having seen the Gulf War and they had done extensive studies. In fact, these two colonels who came out with the book of Unrestricted Warfare, they mentioned this, that the only apple worth considering in the Gulf War, this is a typical Chinese speak, was the employment of air power by the Western coalition. And ever since China, there's been a clear shift, very systematically and strategically over the next decade. In fact, 2 decades of white papers, defense white papers, lay down a very clear format of how would the Chinese Air Force need to develop and build this capacity. So systematically, the Chinese Air Force has hived away its shift of focus from the large numbers to numbers with capability. So if you see today, the Chinese Air Force is mostly 4th generation platforms and including 5th generation platforms, and is rapidly moving towards the 6th generation platform. So that is the main content. So the mainstay of the Chinese Air Force in the future will be 4.5 to 5 generations, and with a fairly large section, 6th generation plus. How has this come about? Because of a systematic focus on the Chinese aviation industry. The biggest threat to China, or the biggest concern, is obviously the Western seaboard and its Taiwan contingency, and all its focus has been there. So even the development of air power, which it has done, the PLAF, has been centered and focused towards its Western seaboard. It had ignored Tibet for a long time because the priority was there. And it has been the PLAF development in the Western seaboard has paid has paid very excellent dividends for them, because it has enabled the PLAF and the plan together have managed to push the US forces out of the first island chain. I mean, they have regained control over the first island chain and striving to do that for the second island chain. But I think Galwan, I beg your pardon, Doklam and Galwan were both the tipping points for them, and they realized that the rate and speed at which the Indian Air Force spun up, deployed its forces, and commenced operations, and we do that very efficiently and quickly, the Indian Air Force, because of naturally the threat perception which we have had all these years. So the rate at which we spun up and we came into play actually concerned the Chinese a lot, and then they noticed this capability. And if we really analyze it deeply, we'll realize that the air power employment which we had done, and since, like you mentioned very rightly, we have the advantage of operating from lower altitude bases and a large number of dispersed bases, and we have a second tier bases, depth bases to launch our missions from as well. The high altitude operating or firefighting capability of the Indian Air Force is much more effective and capable at the present vis-a-vis the Chinese, who are restricted to the high altitudes. Second factor is the Chinese Air Force, or the PLAF. Its offensive air power capability is very limited presently. It's sort of substituted or compensated for this lack by extensive use of the rocket force in this region. But clearly, the Chinese have seen this disadvantage, have been concerned about it, and has factored it into a strategic matrix. Because now look at the pace at which there is a rapid development going on in Tibet in terms of infrastructure, deployment of forces, and increasing air operations. So in the future, it will certainly be a much more tricky situation, because this margin of advantage which we have, which I like to call, and in all my writings I say, is an asymmetric advantage in our deterrence capability. This asymmetric advantage is rapidly reducing because of our reduced numbers and reduced capabilities, which if we don't sort of give it a shot in the arm in a hurry, we'll reach a stage where Chinese Air Force will be able to prevail over our Air Force's capability, which means we will have to be fighting a defensive battle all the way through. And that is a serious concern for all operations in the continental domain.
Okay, that seems pretty serious to me. And I have another question, and that question emerges from this generation of aircraft that you're talking about. I have two questions on that. One is, of course, it will be nice if you introduce our audience to these various generation aircrafts, and we keep talking about the fifth generation fighter, and we are struggling for it, and the US has it, the Chinese have it in J-20. And the second question is, if the generation of aircrafts are going to go like this, would there be a chance that the Chinese would bridge this asymmetrical gap primarily based on a development in their generational aircraft? Yeah, one is a generic concept of generations of aircraft going on, which has a standard definition. Could there be terrain specific also? I mean, I would not know, but let's say example that basically the disadvantage that China has is to pick up the load from high altitudes in terms of their bombardment capabilities, which we have. So will the generation aircraft could lend them this uh, change this disadvantage for them in future? After having explained what are the generation, you could probably take on this also. This is a personal doubt that I have.
And it is very interestingly, I think, a common doubt which prevails in the open domain, that what is this thing about generations of aircraft, and why is there, fifth, sixth generation and all in coming in such quick succession? Actually, if you look at it, it goes down to basically defining a technology trend, a benchmarking of technological capabilities of a platform. So if you look at it, probably the World War One and Two capabilities were first and second generation. Third generation platforms came in during the Korean and the Vietnam War, which were the classic examples with the F-4 Phantom and the MiG-21 aircraft. Uh, uh, the earlier Sabres. So these were third generation aircraft. Fourth generation aircraft came in with the F-16s, with the MiG-29s, which brought in the Mirages. These were considered fourth generation aircraft. So if you see in each of these, they have been defining elements. That means in the first and second generation aircraft were limited to guns, air-to-air guns only as weapons. It could carry bombs and rockets, but for its self-defense and air defense roles, it had only limited to guns. By the Korean War, air-to-air missiles came into the situation, and that brought in air-to-air missiles of a vintage quality, which were pure heat-seeking missiles. As we progressed onto a fourth generation aircraft, not only the platform, the weapon capabilities also changed. We had all aspect missiles coming in, which could be fired from any aspect. It doesn't have to be a tail-on heat-seeking missile, which you had to fire from the rear of another against another aircraft. So we had aircraft which you could fire even from head-on quarters, face to face. That means when two aircraft are facing each other. And then you came with beyond visual range missiles, which means it were fired from ranges way beyond the visual sighting ranges, and which were earlier about 8-10 kilometers, which now goes on to about 60, 100. And China's moving towards missiles which are close to 300-400 kilometers of standoff ranges. So this, along with the weapon systems and the platform, is what makes a generation of an aircraft. The platform capabilities improve in terms of its pure aerodynamic capability, its aircraft design, its surface, in fact, the elements and the carbon fiber, the bodies from pure metal and aluminum designs moved on to composites and advanced, what should I say, metallurgical surfaces, and which are stealth capable, means which reduce a visual signature of an aircraft, or oral signature of an aircraft, or a radar signature of an aircraft, actually. But I'll also, there's a caveat here, there's nothing called a pure stealth fighter. There are fighters with higher degrees of invisibility. supposed invisibility, which is what we talk about stealth capability, but has its limits, because with every improvement in aircraft capability, there's a better sensor system which can catch this platform through this invisibility. So present day generation, what we have with our platforms, the Sukhois and the Mirages are classically fourth generation platforms. The Rafale is probably a 4.5 generation platform. So will the Sukhoi and the Mirage be once they are upgraded. Uh, China has already a fifth generation platform operating opposite us, and it is rapidly moving towards a sixth generation platform. Our fifth generation platform, which we are striving for, is the AMCA, and the AMCA is a long time away. Unfortunately for us, why this to
If
add
you
to
can
our
only, if you can only, say what is the full form of AMCA?
so okay, so advanced medium
Advanced, yeah,
combat aircraft. So it is basically the Indian version of the
the,
of
the
the fifth generation
fifth
platform.
generation.
But if you'll notice, the US fifth generation platforms are the F-22 and the F-35, and it is working on its NG-80, the new generation air dominance fighter, which is the sixth generation US
Sixth generation.
platform. So is China racing ahead with the sixth generation platform. And the tragedy is, by the time we can strive to start inducting fifth generation platforms into our Air Force inventory, it is a minimum of 10 years plus away. By which time, all the platforms which China puts across us, most of it will be fifth generation in Tibet. And by the time our fifth generation come in, Chinese sixth generation fighters would have stabilized. So you understand when you mention it appears serious. It's not just serious. It is, I think, to my mind, it's a critical aspect of our deterrence strategy, our deterrence capability, and our national security.
Okay, means I agree with you, and I don't think you can do very much about it except for hope that things will go on. But where is AMCA currently? What is the state it is in? If you have any understanding or knowledge of that,
Yeah,
where are
I
we?
do have some amount of knowledge, but things are happening at such a pace. I must say here that we have been the biggest challenge remains the engine, and you will appreciate that that is what we had gone into this deal with this US 404 and
US,
414,
yeah.
and we had hoped that this will help us make the Tejas Mark II, the engine for the Tejas Mark II, and a development for the AMCA as well. So while we may get everything else, engines are incredibly hard to produce. And Indian aviation industry, if you remember, we had produced the HF-24 way back, and it was a fantastic platform, which was designed by Kurt Tank, the German scientist, and the Indian aviation industry. But it never saw a future beyond the point of a limited use for a short period of time. It was because of its engines, and we've had this problem in engines so unless we have a, a robust engine capability, our platforms will have issues. And this gap which has come, unfortunately, this MRC, the multi-role combat aircraft, which we were struggling for the last 10 years, it has done enormous damage. And we today are this 114 aircraft which we are short of. If we don't get that, we are in serious, serious trouble. And that is something which the Atmanirbharta cannot, even in its best of capability, uh, help us bridge this gap. Because to my mind, Atmanirbharta is most certainly a very vital, important strategy. But for air power perspective, it's a long-term strategy. It's a strategy in the making. The biggest strategy of Atmanirbharta for aviation industry is building its capacity, which is going to take a long time of research, development, a lot of investment before it can produce a capacity and scale of the numbers that we need at the rate at which we can. That is a long way off. So we have no choice that to support our Atmanirbhar strategy, we have to continue with a certain amount of exports in the interim.
So yeah, my next question was, I get what you're saying, and I'll build the same question into my next question, that HL continues to remain the only worthwhile air manufacturing so-called public sector unit company in India. And every attempt from Atmanirbharta in as far as Indian Air Force is concerned is purely limited to HAL. Uh, HAL has come out of its bad times, I know that. But do you think HAL, and you almost said that it is not possible for them to do it, but what if we really have to get to Atmanirbharta in the Indian Air Force soonest? I wouldn't say immediately, soonest. What steps or what is the direction in which the industry should take? Should the private industry come in a big way? And would that investment that it would make, would it be supported? Would it fetch back the revenue, or should the government bear the cost of it? These are questions that continue to haunt any person who is thinking in terms of privatization. So what are your thoughts? My question relates to the fact HA is not good enough as a single entity to look after the gap that is created. If that be so, what options does India have?
I think, as you very rightly put it, the HAL has sort of come out of its past legacy problems which they have, and they are working hard to upscale their capabilities. But as I mentioned, aviation industry, military aviation typically, is not just about producing platforms. It's a whole ecosystem which talks about, like I mentioned, metallurgy, engines, avionics, radars, systems, weapon systems, seeker heads of weapon systems. These are usually all proprietary items, which all nations which own these capabilities, are capabilities which they have usually hugely invested in over times and over a long period in terms of research and development, and they will not be in a hurry to part with it. And geopolitics plays a huge role in it, because there are limits to which a nation will share its capabilities with another nation. And they are all politics, as we know, other fickle bet partners. So this becomes a challenge. In India's case, I while there's a huge amount of effort towards privatization, but even privatization means you need to build capacity in terms of research and development. It's not just that tomorrow a private industry can start producing things immediately. It will also need private research, industry, and development. So it is about capacity building at an enormous scale, which is what actually we need to focus on for the next 10 years. But unfortunately, what has happened is we are pinning our hopes of platform and inventory recovery on an industry which itself is struggling to expand its scale and capacity. So my focus would be that in this period, as a nation, we need to take a larger view, that if air power is really going to be an asymmetric deterrent and keeps this difference or this concern going, as long as we can get the enemy concerned enough that, okay, here is a nation with a fairly potent air power capability, and shapes its it shapes its behavior, is what we want. But to maintain this asymmetric deterrence, you cannot rely entirely on the outcomes of the strategic Atmanirbharta, which will pay dividends 10, 15 years later. So, what do you do in this gap? In this gap, you have no choice but to invest heavily and in large quantity. I mean, 114 platforms is not a small amount, and that will only take care to fill the gap of the MiG-21 legacy, which has been left behind. And our older platforms, Jaguars and all, will at some stage start phasing out. Mirages, MiG-29s will also start phasing out at some point. So it's an ongoing challenge. So unless and until we really understand the advantage, the critical advantage this asymmetric air power provides us, and we tighten our belt for a large chunk of a capex on acquisition of these platforms uh, over the next 10 years to tide over this critical gap, to stop this downslide, we are in trouble. So we need to not only handhold the sort of indigenous industry, the HAL and the DRDO, in not just of platforms in terms of weapon capabilities, radars, other defense, air defense, and other aerial ecosystems. We also have to balance it out. So if you have a binary focus that Atman then Varta and nothing else, then we are going to be in serious trouble.
Okay. I agree with you. And I had two questions emerging out of this answer that you. My first is, and it's a thought that I always carry. What is the Air Force thoughts about the overall ecosystem about capability building through knowledge? Now, tell me, what is the quantum of young boys who are doing weapon technology as a specializing subject, including for Air Force across the IITs or universities in India? If tomorrow, even if we have to get somebody to work, do we have qualified people for that? I personally feel like you don't. But has the Air Force taken any initiative towards that? Worked with the IITs to kind of give incentives to young people to come into the niche territory? This is cutting edge technology as far as the world is concerned, weapons technology. And for getting somebody inside, he has to have a support of either a corporate or the government. So, how does this ecosystem building up? Is there any thought to that?
Oh, there is sort of realization on this, and it is something which the Indian Air Force has been savvy about for fair amount of time, and it has been, if you remember, uh, the Indian Air Force regularly sends its engineers to IITs to do their post graduation and uh, advanced studies. But that is not enough. Like you mentioned, you need the larger amount of youth to be involved in this. And I think it is not just the Indian Air Force, there's been a realization across all the services today. So there's a huge amount of engagement which has increased. Uh, it's taken a long time to get there, but you will appreciate, like, I'll give you an example. The United States has something called the DARPA, which is the equivalent of DRDO, an earlier equivalent of DRDO, which focuses on cutting edge technology. But what it does is it engages with the US academia
Okay.
in a big way.
Yes.
And so what it does is build the labs, invest money in labs in universities, in colleges, in academia, and fosters this greater research and development. In our case, that was not so. Our focus was only on the defense industries and defense PSUs for research and development. But today there's a greater realization for that. But you need deep pockets to start a large scale research and developmental base. And research and developmental base, like I said, are long term investments. So there are a great amount of realization and hand holding with civilian academia, with the aviation industry across the board, in both in the private and the public sector. And but it will still need to be encouraged in a much more aggressive fashion. I find it is pretty heartwarming when I engage with a lot of the strategic think tanks, and I find there are a huge amount of youngsters today who are so aware of strategic perspectives of our national security and international security. We need a similar kind of thought and engagement at a level,
And
at an academic level, for which is technology focused, which will meet our future requirements. And for itself, the Air Force also has done a lot of introspection and expanded on what we call that are making our air warriors truly scholar warriors as well, in the truest sense. And the present chief had given it a huge amount of push. And we have something, the new program, something called the Warfare and Aerospace Strategy Program, which has undergone its third iteration. For the last 3 years, we've had them, where we look at fostering critical thinking amongst our younger generation. And the best part is, I think today, with technology having opened out, with the information technology available at everyone's hand, I think this holding and engagement will increase at a much more rapid race and an accelerated pace than what you and me have been used to over the years.
I'm very glad to hear that. Throughout my career, I've been most worried about this particular aspect. I'm sure it will pick up. So I will now take you on to an entirely different field, and that is space, a new dimension. The last frontier, as they say. So, as you know, space is the new frontier, and most militaries in the world are looking at space, which they say is going to be the future battlefield in the world. India, one has been hearing about Space Command, and it's coming. Yet nothing seems to be known in the public domain. So, would you be able to give us some insight as to where we are? We are thinking, obviously, I'm sure. What are we thinking, and how long will it take for us to really make a difference or come to the levels where rest of the countries are so-called adversaries?
Uh, at the outset, I'll clarify one aspect. So that is, space is a domain which India for long uh, adhered to the fact that space was only for peaceful uses. And when we talk about militarization of space, it is no longer a future possibility. It's already a reality.
Happened, yeah.
Space has already been militarized. And we have been slow on on its when it comes to looking at space from a national security perspective, while we looked at it from a developmental perspective for peaceful uses for a very, very long time. And India has a very robust space environment and capability, but the military use is something which was we had been eschewing for a long time. But today, I think, without stating it so, but from most of the narratives that you get in our strategic domain, in all the writings, I think there's a clear realization that there's a near, what should I say, a neo realpolitik approach which India has towards space. And that is why the defense minister actually made a statement to say that the Indian Air Force should now look at becoming a aerospace power. Now, coming from a defense minister specifically for a service uh, means that the political leadership has thought about it for a long time. In the Shangri-La dialogues,
Dialogue.
the Prime Minister had said, and this is many years back, I think 2018, when he said that India's airways, seaways, and spaceways must be free for common use. And that is the first time I think an Indian Prime Minister has ever factored in space and air in the same breath in an international forum. And that actually is the heart of the Sagar strategy, the seas and growth for all in the region. But Indian Air Force has looked at space from a very different perspective, because typically, like most of the air forces in the world, lot of its capabilities are space dependent. Gulf War, you'll appreciate, was the first, what they call the first space war, where space-based capabilities came into action and where they were proven and tested in battle. The Indian Air Force uses space for meteorology, navigation, PNT, communications, targeting. I mean, it's immense. So do other services, but in probably with the reliance is a little lesser. Whereas in Indian Air Force, the dependency on space is much more. And while other air forces, I must clarify here, have looked at space as a specific air force domain, so to say, like the US, France, and a lot of other countries which have done, and that's why they're calling their air and space forces now. Indian Air Force is very clear in this. In fact, the latest doctrine, which is 2022 December, which came out, is very clear that Indian Air Force considers space as a commons for the Indian ecosystem for all the three services. Everyone has a justifiable and uh, very important, what should I say, need and necessity to have open access to space. So it doesn't lay any claim on ownership of space, but it is just that uh, the air and space domain are a continuum. If you look at it, unlike the other services, the Indian Air Force looks at the airspace, which technically extends up to 60,000, 50 to 60,000 feet. That is what it is internationally accepted. Uh, but while there's no defining line here, but the near space, which is in the realm of aerospace, extends up to 100 kilometers, which is called the Kármán line, which is an imaginary line. Beyond the Kármán line is supposed to be space proper. Below that is near space. So this airspace and near space is almost a continuum of almost practically 100 odd kilometers, which has become critical because that region also is a transient volume of airspace where weapons will transit through. Missiles, ballistic missiles, space-based weapons, low orbit satellites, they all use this airspace. So there's a growing need and understanding that when we talk about airspace, it is the air and near space which has to be factored in. So we have to look at space from two different perspectives. Outer space, which has ISRO as a lead service, and near space capabilities, which will also include the ballistic missile defense, which comes into the realm for national security and defense. So there has to be some breaking of silos and hand holding across the military and the civilian space programs to bring in this cohesion and transition. And something which I think the the Space Department, which had been created sometime, which is doing a lot of work, which will automatically probably upscale into a command in the near future. But there is a lot to do here. I think all the services are cognizant of it, and I'm sure we'll see a lot of changes coming up very rapidly in the near future.
I agree with you on that. And I would not quiz you more because there is so much to space. And a lot of it may be in domain which probably not likely to be open to public. So, but I will take from what I asked you in the earlier question about Space Command, and that is theaterization. And you didn't mention anything on that, but it is a common belief that the theaterization of Indian military it's been said that it will take place for a long time, but haven't really shaped up the way people would have, or maybe the Kargil Committee report, all of the reports would have wanted. And it is believed, I mean, it's not its perception, be wrong that the Air Force has some role to play in it because of some observation or objections they had. So, would you be open to telling us that what is the Air Force view on theaterization and how does the Air Force look at this whole concept and where do you think it will really happen?
I will start with a very clear clarification, which has, I think, been cleared by the several chiefs and the last two chiefs, at least in succession, very clearly, that the IAF has no issues with the concept of theaterization per se. But there are challenges when we look at the employment of air power from a theater construct. Theaterization construct, as it is known in the world over, is something which the US and the World War II created, where there were different. The World War was fought in actually different theaters: the Pacific, the Asian theater, the European theater, the North African theater. So, which necessitated they were all different continents and different continental land and maritime spaces, which necessitated actually independent militaries practically to fight in these in areas. And these militaries would obviously have its own land, sea, and air forces committed to it. So, from an Indian Air Force perspective, and from a personal perspective, I would like to clarify one thing: that theater command is in the way we have looked at it in India has been a army driven approach, understandably, because the army is the largest and our continental threat is the most real live threat which is staring us in the face. So there is no denying that. But while we do this, because army is used to apportioning resources and its command structure, it very clearly has to have everything under a linear chain of command. Air Force functions in an entirely different manner. Air Force functions what we call about centralized planning and decentralized operations, where while the resources are spread out in separate commands, which, mind you, have been were created to support the army commands. So there is a construct there itself. Then ideally, air power is not limited by boundaries, land boundaries, and this is the critical thing which we need to bear in mind. And when we talk about land boundaries, I'm talking about intra-theater and inter-theater boundaries. Whereas air power is used in a more today, especially earlier we had platform issues where we had like MiG-21s which were base dependent. You know, if there were certain bases in western sector and certain bases in eastern sector, they were tied down to these bases. But today all our platforms are capable of switching, and they do, and that is what is there in our plans, is how they switch from one command resource from where they very rapidly become resource of one command in one mission, and fly another mission for another command and probably land back in a third command. This is something which runs in contrast with the way army functions. Second aspect, which is I must bring out here, is that the continental construct when the Western sector is a little different, where we talked about offensive action and going into depth in the Western sector. On the northern front, it's more about holding the line and not allowing ceding a inch of our territory. And that is what been our strategy. It's been a defensive strategy. But in this defensive strategy, there would be limited offensives by the army. But these are, if you look at it in scale, very limited to the tactical battle spaces. But whereas the Air Force's capabilities are for depth targeting as well, which goes into strategic depths across the Western sector, which can hit industrial targets there. And in the north, it can hit depth targets in the entire Tibet region. So offensive use of air power comes in sort of a constraint and clash in a defensive oriented thinking from a theater perspective. So these are the only two constraints really, and resources. We don't have adequate resources. But where the solution lies, and today I think there's a great understanding in this. Air Force was, I mean, there's nothing to hide here. The Air Force was considered a spoiler. It has been put out in the open domain in so many words. And the Air Force is very clear that we've been looked at spoil sport for a long time, and we have taken it with a broad shoulder. But I think today, some fault lay with us as well, that we probably didn't articulate this in open domain for a very long time, because we were, I will say, not very savvy in our narrative building. But today, I think there's a great amount of maturity and understanding. And I'm personally aware that the way CDS is looking at the whole theaterization, it's a very much more nuanced, balanced approach, where the structure is a robust structure, truly integrated structure in terms of jointmanship, where core competencies of each service remains, but brought to play in a joint application of force. And that is what the structure must be, than pure independent joint, yet theater separated joint forces. So that is my clear, about as clear as I can put it.
Marshal Chaudhary, you labored at pain to explain the Air Force's point of view. I'm sure that with time, in times to come, with mature heads and mature thought process, it will ultimately settle down to a more amicable solution. I'm sure there would be a solution. Nothing.
I must add here, sir. I must genuinely add this, because I've been going around and talking in all the war colleges on a regular basis for the last 3 years. There is an immense realization among the younger generations, because they are technology savvy. They know how technology makes a difference and how air power will make a difference in their respective domains. And today there's a greater realization amongst them that we cannot look at our national security purely from a continental or a maritime perspective, but a larger, more comprehensive, multi-domain approach. So I think the future will make this theaterization a much more practical, robust, and implementable strategy.
Thank you for that. I mean, I'm thanking you for that. I'm sure the nation will be also thanking you for that. So that brings me to the end of this wonderful session, that first session. And I thank you deeply on behalf of CAS for making it so, what should I say, so exhaustive and so interesting. And I leave you with the last question. So which of the aircrafts would you have personally preferred to fly in, if you want to add that as your last comment?
When you ask a hardcore fighter pilot about his favorite platform, it gravitates towards something which you have spent a lot of time on. And I have flown the MiG-21 extensively. My heart is still in it. It's such an amazing, simple platform, and the versatility with which we used it in Indian Air Force is amazing. No other Air Force has done it in the world. So that was probably, I'll put it, the first love. But when you come to pure hardcore combat, close combat, and dog fighting, I think the MiG-29 was an unparalleled platform. I mean, compared to any of the more contemporary fighters. The Sukhoi, with its capabilities, a large fighter, is an immensely capable fighter. So are the Rafales. But given a choice, I would probably imagine ideal Air Force today or in the future, comprising of more a huge section of upgraded Sukhois, because that will be the mainstay platform,
Yeah.
and future versions of the Sukhoi, or a replacement of that kind, as well as a platform like the Rafale. It makes, I
Rafale.
think, immense strategic sense to have two
Both.
separate platforms,
I
both with
agree.
countries which have fairly robust, long strategic ties, and which we are not at the mercy, at the fickle mercy of changing geopolitics, where these things are constrained by by some of the nations which are today producing this advanced platform. So I think these two platforms and developing on them, obviously, and most obviously, a huge future of Tejas and its future variants, uh, Tejas, the Amka, so that the dependency on external platform reduces, and we have
Deuces.
increasingly a mainstay fleet which is indigenous.
Thank you. With that note, Marshal Chaudhary, wonderful talking to you, and wish you all the best. And hopefully, we probably have another session with you sometime. Thank you very much. I'll say goodbye to you. Uh,
Thank you, sir. It's been a
thank
pleasure speaking to the cast. And like I said, it was the opening round. I don't know where the ball has been hit.
let's hope we get some likes and some hits, and people
Absolutely.
ask for more. So, like yours, this is also mine first. So let's hope that
No,
we
no,
continue on this.
I'm sure it will, sir. And it's a great beginning, sir. And thank you for having me over. And it's been a pleasure talking to you till now, sir. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Bye. Take care. Thank you.
Good day, sir.